The revolving door is the term for going from a government job into the lobbying industry and cashing in. Public servants who had their eye on their next job and realize that the people lobbying them are going to give them that job are not likely to be honest public servants. The whole arrangement, unfortunately, breeds corruption. It breeds people looking forward to their next job instead of doing the job they're there to do.
In Washington, D.C. is power affiliation. And by power affiliation, you're talking about access to political power and access to public officials. And that comes through lobbying.
In the old days, back when Lyndon Johnson was majority leader in the Senate, you would come into his office, he had a shoebox, and you'd deposit money, maybe $100,000 to get what you wanted. So today, whoever the Lyndon Johnson is, you go in, that Harry Reid, the majority leader in the Senate, you're not going to come in and give him $100,000 in a shoebox, but you are going to come in and give him, $25,000 PAC checks, which you go $100,000. So the process is different. It seems different. The result is the same.
I hate to use the word corruption, but it borders on it.
Jack Abramoff may be the most notorious and crooked lobbyist of our time. He was at the center of a massive scandal of brazen corruption and influence peddling. As a Republican lobbyist starting in the mid-1990s, he became a master at showering gifts on lawmakers in return for their votes on legislation and tax breaks favorable to his client. He was so good at it, he took home $20 million a year. It all came crashing down 5 years ago when Jack Abramoff pled guilty to corrupting public officials, tax evasion, and fraud, and served 3.5 years in prison. Today, he's a symbol of how money corrupts Washington. Abramoff would provide freebies and gifts, looking for favors for his clients in return. He'd lavish certain congressmen and senators with access to private jets and junkets to the world's great golf destinations like St. Andrews in Scotland, free meals at his own upscale Washington restaurant, and access to the best tickets to all the area's sporting events, including 2 skyboxes at Washington Redskins games.
The politician, particularly one in leadership or one that's powerful, can really make or break a company. So companies and other entities are put in a situation where they have to play ball, because if they don't, bad things are going to happen.
Basically, instead of buying votes, they are selling decisions.
Yes, I think the model, the way we always think of the influence market in DC is that it's like bribery, that you have these outside interests that in effect bribing our politicians, and that certainly can take place. I think the bigger problem is more akin to extortion, where the politicians identify wealthy companies or industries and they basically mark them for extortion. They introduce pieces of legislation or they threaten certain things that put those entities in a position to where they have to play ball.
One person who knows all about this fully legal form of extortion is the former president of Shell Oil USA, John Hofmeister.
I realize that there is a price to participate in the political process. What I never knew was what a huge price it was and how it was an endless process of continuously being hit up for money.
In 2008, when oil prices were skyrocketing, Hofmeister was hauled before committee after congressional committee, 18 different hearings. Some members of Congress even threatened to nationalize his industry. The televised hearings, all political theater, he says, when the camera lights turned off. Some of the very members who criticized him in public were asking for money in private. And he says, you'd better pay.
There's a huge price to not pay the price of the campaign request.
Really?
There's a price in terms of access. There's a price in terms of interest by the member. And so if you haven't paid your price of entry, who are you?
What I think you're describing to me is wink and a nod extortion.
It's pay to play. And I agree with the word extortion. As harsh a word as that is, it's an atrocity that nobody seems to care about because it just goes on and goes on.
Leadership PACs that were created as a way for congressional leaders of both parties to raise money and distribute it to their members have evolved into something different. Today, nearly every congressman and senator has a leadership PAC, not just the leaders, and they're used to solicit contributions from friends and supporters in order to advance their political agendas, their careers, and in many cases, their lifestyle. Georgia Senator Saxby Chambliss likes golf, so much so that he spent more than $100,000 the past 2 years entertaining at some of the finest courses in the world. New York Congressman Gregory Meeks prefers football. He spent $35,000 on NFL games. All of this was paid for with political contributions, all in the name of democracy.
I think campaign fundraising is increasingly not just about winning elections. It's a lifestyle subsidy.
Its former chairman, Trevor Potter, says the commission has consistently recommended to Congress that it outlaw the personal use of leadership PACs.
And what's happened to that recommendation?
Nothing. It enters a black hole.
That's because the leadership PACs have become a political annuity for Congress that members can cash in when they leave office or hold on to for the future.
What you see more often is that members will keep the leadership PAC and they will use it in retirement for everything that is vaguely a political expense. If they become a lobbyist, which about half of members who leave Congress do nowadays, that becomes their lobbying slush fund.
When Congress passed the Ethics Reform Act of 1989, it plainly stated a member shall convert no campaign funds to personal use. But soon afterwards, congressional leaders quietly invented something called leadership PACs, political action committees that were not technically campaign funds and thus exempt from the personal use prohibition.
One example of a slush fund that may not be anticipated by most is that of Obamacare. As Forbes states, a little noticed part of President Obama's Affordable Care Act channels some $12.5 billion into a vaguely defined prevention and public health fund over the next decade. The department can spend the money as it sees fit and without going through the congressional appropriation process. It is estimated that by 2022, the department will be able to spend $2 billion per year at its sole discretion. As could be expected, this has raised concerns about questionable and possibly illegal use of Obamacare prevention fund money to lobby, an ambiguous term that the administration interprets narrowly and its critics broadly.
We have a snapshot in time after September 11th where at least 71 companies that we were able to identify are starting to get contracts to go in Afghanistan and Iraq. All of the top 10 companies had former U.S. officials who had worked in the Pentagon or other parts of the U.S. government on their boards of directors or as their top executives. It's known as the revolving door, and people cash in all the time. Public officials go to work for companies and they make triple, quadruple, 10 times, sometimes as much money as they used to make in public service.
There's too close a relationship, and there's outright, I hate to use the word corruption, but it borders on it, the behavior of some of these individuals, both in industry and in the Pentagon.
The number one recipient of contracts was Vice President Cheney's former company, Halliburton, and its subsidiary, Kellogg Brown & Root.
It seems that the politicians are the ones that are greedy, selfish, power hungry. They build up their power by granting people government programs, spending other people's money.
And no one is the least bit surprised.
Everyone in Washington knows this goes on. It's well known, an open secret. The problem is people in Ohio and New Mexico have no idea what's going on here in Washington.
Sloan says another way congressmen can personally benefit from the use of political contributions is by making personal loans to their campaign funds, then charging above market and sometimes exorbitant interest rates. Sloan's organization found at least 15 cases, with the worst offender being Democratic Congresswoman Grace Napolitano, who charged her campaign 18%.
How much money did she loan her campaign?
She loaned herself $150,000 and over a 12-year period took in $228,000 in interest.
I think everybody would like that investment.
I think so.
And that's legal.
And that's legal.
Sloan says there are at least 75 members of Congress who have hired members of their family to work on their campaign and paid them with political contributions. Until Republican Congressman Ron Paul of Texas retired last year, he seemed to be the leader with 6 family members on the campaign payroll. But Paul only ranked 3rd in total payouts to family members, behind former Republican Congressman Jerry Lewis and Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters, both of California.
For some congressmen and senators, this is sort of a family business.
Absolutely. It's a family business. They have members of their family on the campaign payroll, and they also will often have members of their family who are lobbyists and lobby on issues in which the member may even be working.
This is a permanent political class that has now kind of formed an aristocracy. And that aristocracy, that's why nothing changes in Washington. It's not the money controls Washington. Washington controls the money. They have an industrial logic to this business model, just like any other business model, and that is to extract power from the rest of the country and money into a centralized location, which is Washington.
Although there are extensive examples of the revolving door phenomena as depicted in these bubbles, there are also organizations that strive to instill regulations in Washington. The most prominent examples are Legistorm, OpenSecrets, and Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, better known by the acronym CREW. The people elect United States government officials as representatives. Now we must demand a level of integrity within their work. After all, our taxes pay their salaries. For this reason, several links can be found below that are credible and beneficial as a starting point for anyone who would like to investigate this crucial matter.